Ramana. The way of knowledge. Ramana Maharshi's spiritual method. In his own words, who am I? As all living beings desire to be happy always, without misery, as in the case of everyone there is observed supreme love for oneself, and as happiness alone is the cause for love, in order to gain that happiness, which is one's nature and which is experienced in the state of deep sleep, where there is no mind, one should know oneself. For that, the path of knowledge, the inquiry of the form, who am I, is the principal means. 1. Who am I? The gross body which is composed of the 7 humours, dhatus, I am not. The 5 cognitive sense organs, the senses of hearing, touch, sight, taste, and smell, which apprehend their respective objects, sound, touch, colour, taste, and odour, I am not. The 5 cognitive sense organs, the organs of speech, locomotion, grasping, excretion, and procreation, which have as their respective functions speaking, moving, grasping, excreting, and enjoying, I am not. The 5 vital airs, prana, etc., which perform respectively the 5 functions of inbreathing, etc., I am not. Even the mind which thinks, I am not. The nescience, too, which is endowed only with the residual impressions of objects and in which there are no objects and no functionings, I am not. 2. If I am none of these, then who am I? After negating all of the above mentioned as not this, that awareness which alone remains, that I am. 3. What is the nature of awareness? The nature of awareness is existence, consciousness, bliss. 4. When will the realization of the self be gained? When the world which is what is seen has been removed, there will be realization of the self which is the seer. 5. Will there not be realization of the self even while the world is there, taken as real? There will not be. 6. Why? The seer and the object seen are like the rope and the snake. Just as the knowledge of the rope, which is the substrate, will not arise unless the false knowledge of the illusory serpent goes, so the realization of the self, which is the substrate, will not be gained unless the belief that the world is real is removed. 7. When will the world, which is the object seen, be removed? When the mind, which is the cause of all cognitions and of all actions, becomes quiescent, the world will disappear. 8. What is the nature of the mind? What is called mind is a wondrous power residing in the self. It causes all thoughts to arise. Apart from thoughts, there is no such thing as mind. Therefore, thought is the nature of mind. Apart from thoughts, there is no independent entity called the world. In deep sleep, there are no thoughts, and there is no world. In the states of waking and dream, there are thoughts, and there is a world also. Just as the spider emits the thread of the web out of itself and again withdraws it into itself, likewise the mind projects the world out of itself and again resolves it into itself. When the mind comes out of the self, the world appears. Therefore, when the world appears to be real, the self does not appear, and when the self appears, shines, the world does not appear. When one persistently inquires into the nature of the mind will end leaving the self as the residue. What is referred to as the self is the Atman. The mind always exists only in dependence on something gross. It cannot stay alone. It is the mind that is called the subtle body or the soul, jiva. 9. What is the path of inquiry for understanding the nature of the mind? That which rises as I in this body is the mind. If one inquires as to where in the body the thought I rises first, one would discover that it rises in the heart. That is the place of the mind's origin. Even if one thinks constantly I, one will be led to that place. Of all the thoughts that arise in the mind, the I thought is the first. It is only after the rise of this that the other thoughts arise. It is after the appearance of the first personal pronoun that the second and third personal pronouns appear, Without the first personal pronoun, there will not be the second and third. 10. How will the mind become quiescent? By the inquiry, who am I? The thought, who am I, will destroy all other thoughts, and like the stick used for stirring the burning pyre, it will itself, in the end, get destroyed. Then there will arise self-realization. 11. What is the means for constantly holding on to the thought, who am I? When other thoughts arise, one should not pursue them, but should inquire, to whom do they arise? It does not matter how many thoughts arise. As each thought arises, one should inquire with diligence, to whom has this thought arisen? The answer that would emerge would be, to me. Thereupon, if one inquires, who am I? The mind will go back to its source, and the thought that arose will become quiescent. With repeated practice in this manner, the mind will develop the skill to stay in its source. When the mind that is subtle goes out through the brain and the sense organs, the gross names and forms appear. When it stays in the heart, the names and forms disappear. Letting the mind go out of the heart is known as externalization, bahirmukha. Thus, when the mind stays in the heart, the I, which is the source of all thoughts, will go, and the self, which ever exists, will shine. Whatever one does, one should do without the egoity I. If one acts in that way, all will appear as of the nature of Siva, God. 12. Are there no other means for making the mind quiescent? Other than inquiry, there are no adequate means. If through other means it is sought to control the mind will appear to be controlled, but will again go forth. Through the control of breath also, the mind will become quiescent, but it will be quiescent only so long as the breath remains controlled, and when the breath resumes, the mind also will again start moving, and will wander as impelled by residual impressions. The source is the same for both mind and breath. Thought, indeed, is the nature of the mind. The thought I is the first thought of the mind, and that is egoity. It is from that whence egoity originates that breath also originates. Therefore, when the mind becomes quiescent, the breath is controlled, and when the breath is controlled, the mind becomes quiescent. But in deep sleep, although the mind becomes quiescent, the breath does not stop. This is because of the will of God, so that the body may be preserved, and other people may not be under the impression that it is dead. In the state of waking and in samadhi, when the mind becomes quiescent, the breath is controlled. Breath is the gross form of mind. Till the time of death, the mind keeps breath in the body, and when the body dies, the mind takes the breath along with it. Therefore, the exercise of breath control is only an aid for rendering the mind quiescent, manonigraha. It will not destroy the mind, manonasa. Like the practice of breath, control, meditation on the forms of God, repetition of mantras, restriction on food, etc., are but aids for rendering the mind quiescent. Through meditation on the forms of God and through repetition of mantras, the mind becomes one-pointed. The mind will always be wandering. Just as when a chain is given to an elephant to hold in its trunk, it will go along grasping the chain and nothing else. So also when the mind is occupied with a name or form, it will grasp that alone. When the mind expands in the form of countless thoughts, each thought becomes weak. But as thoughts get resolved, the mind becomes one-pointed and strong. For such a mind, self-inquiry will become easy. Of all the restrictive rules, that relating to the taking of sattvic food in moderate quantities is the best. By observing this rule, the sattvic quality of mind will increase, and that will be helpful to self-inquiry. 13. The residual impressions, thoughts of objects, appear wending like the waves of an ocean. When will all of them get destroyed? As the meditation on the self rises higher and higher, the thoughts will get destroyed. 14. Is it possible for the residual impressions of objects that come from beginningless time, as it were, to be resolved, and for one to remain as the pure self? Without yielding to the doubt, is it possible or not? One should persistently hold on to the meditation on the self. Even if one be a great sinner, one should not worry and weep, "Oh, I am a sinner, how can I be saved?" One should completely renounce the thought, "I am a sinner," and concentrate keenly on meditation on the self. Then, one would surely succeed. There are not two minds, one good and the other evil. The mind is only one. It is the residual impressions that are of two kinds, auspicious and inauspicious. When the mind is under the influence of auspicious impressions, it is called good, and when it is under the influence of inauspicious impressions, it is regarded as evil. The mind should not be allowed to wander towards worldly objects and what concerns other people. However bad other people may be, one should bear no hatred for them. Both desire and hatred should be eschewed. All that one gives to others, one gives to one's self. If this truth is understood, who will not give to others? When one's self arises, all arises. When one's self becomes quiescent, all becomes quiescent. To the extent we behave with humility, to that extent there will result good. If the mind is rendered quiescent, one may live anywhere. 15. How long should inquiry be practiced? As long as there are impressions of objects in the mind, so long the inquiry, "Who am I?" is required. As thoughts arise, they should be destroyed then and there, in the very place of their origin, through inquiry. If one resorts to contemplation of the self unintermittently, until the self is gained, that alone would do. As long as there are enemies within the fortress, they will continue to sally forth. If they are destroyed as they emerge, the fortress will fall into our hands. 16. What is the nature of the self? What exists in truth is the self alone. The world, the individual soul, and God are appearances in it. Like silver in mother of pearl, these three appear at the same time and disappear at the same time. The self is that where there is absolutely no I thought. That is called silence. The self itself is the world. The self itself is I. The self itself is God. All is Siva, the self. 17. Is not everything the work of God? Without desire, resolve, or effort, the sun rises, and in its mere presence the sunstone emits fire, the lotus blooms, water evaporates, people perform their various functions and then rest. Just as in the presence of the magnet the needle moves, it is by virtue of the mere presence of God that the souls governed by the three cosmic functions, or the fivefold divine activity, perform their actions and then rest, in accordance with their respective karmas. God has no resolve, no karma attaches itself to him. That is like worldly actions not affecting the sun, or like the merits and demerits of the other four elements not affecting all-pervading space. 18. Of the devotees, who is the greatest? He who gives himself up to the self that is God is the most excellent devotee. Giving one's self up to God means remaining constantly in the self without giving room for the rise of any thoughts other than that of the self. Whatever burdens are thrown on God, he bears them. Since the supreme power of God makes all things move, why should we, without submitting ourselves to it, constantly worry ourselves with thoughts as to what should be done and what should not be done and how not? We know that the train carries all loads, so after getting on it, why should we carry our small luggage on our head to our discomfort, instead of putting it down in the train and feeling at ease? 19. What is non-attachment? As thoughts arise, destroying them utterly without any residue in the very place of their origin is non-attachment. Just as the pearl diver ties a stone to his waist, sinks to the bottom of the sea, and there takes the pearls, so each one of us should be endowed with non-attachment, dive within oneself, and obtain the self-pearl. 20. Is it not possible for God and the Guru to effect the release of a soul? God and the Guru will only show the way to release. They will not by themselves take the soul to the state of release. In truth, God and the Guru are not different. Just as the prey, which has fallen into the jaws of a tiger, has no escape, so those who have come within the ambit of the Guru's gracious look will be saved by the Guru and will not get lost. Yet each one should by his own effort pursue the path shown by God or Guru and gain release. One can know oneself only with one's own eye of knowledge, and not with somebody else's. Does he who is Rama require the help of a mirror to know that he is Rama? 21. Is it necessary for one who longs for release to inquire into the nature of categories, tattvas? Just as one who wants to throw away garbage has no need to analyze it and see what it is, so one who wants to know the self has no need to count the number of categories or inquire into their characteristics. What he has to do is to reject altogether the categories that hide the self. The world should be considered like a dream. 22. Is there no difference between waking and dream? Waking is long and a dream short. Other than this, there is no difference. Just as waking happenings seem real while awake, so do those in a dream while dreaming. In dream, the mind takes on another body. In both waking and dream states, thoughts, names and forms occur simultaneously. 23. Is it any use reading books for those who long for release? All the texts say that in order to gain release, one should render the mind quiescent. Therefore, their conclusive teaching is that the mind should be rendered quiescent. Once this has been understood, there is no need for endless reading. In order to quieten the mind, one has only to inquire within oneself what one's self is. How could this search be done in books? One should know one's self with one's own eye of wisdom. The self is within the 5 sheaths, but books are outside them. Since the self has to be inquired into by discarding the 5 sheaths, it is futile to search for it in books. There will come a time when one will have to forget all that one has learned. 24. What is happiness? Happiness is the very nature of the self. Happiness and the self are not different. There is no happiness in any object of the world. We imagine through our ignorance that we derive happiness from objects. When the mind goes out, it experiences misery. In truth, when its desires are fulfilled, it returns to its own place and enjoys the happiness that is the self. Similarly, in the states of sleep, samadhi and fainting, and when the object desired is obtained or the object disliked is removed, the mind becomes inward turned and enjoys pure self-happiness. Thus the mind moves without rest, alternately going out of the self and returning to it. Under the tree, the shade is pleasant. Out in the open, the heat is scorching. A person who has been going about in the sun feels cool when he reaches the shade. Someone who keeps on going from the shade into the sun and then back into the shade is a fool. A wise man stays permanently in the shade. Similarly, the mind of the one who knows the truth does not leave Brahman. The mind of the ignorant, on the contrary, revolves in the world, feeling miserable, and for a little time returns to Brahman to experience happiness. In fact, what is called the world is only thought. When the world disappears, i.e., when there is no thought, the mind experiences happiness. And when the world appears, it goes through misery. 25. What is wisdom insight? Jnana Drishti. Remaining quiet is what is called wisdom insight. To remain quiet is to resolve the mind in the self. Telepathy, knowing past, present, and future happenings and clairvoyance do not constitute wisdom insight. 26. What is the relation between desirelessness and wisdom? Desirelessness is wisdom. The two are not different, they are the same. Desirelessness is refraining from turning the mind towards any object. Wisdom means the appearance of no object. In other words, not seeking what is other than the self is detachment or desirelessness, Not leaving the self is wisdom. 27. What is the difference between inquiry and meditation? Inquiry consists in retaining the mind in the self. Meditation consists in thinking that one's self is Brahman, existence, consciousness, bliss. 28. What is release? Inquiring into the nature of one's self that is in bondage, and realizing one's true nature, is release. Part 2. Ramana Maharshi's Life and Work. Almost all human beings have a sense of self or I-ness which permeates their consciousness. It is an undeniable feeling of individuality. Yet what exactly is this I motivating our day-to-day actions? Is it a physical sensation, the outcome of material processes? A mental perception based upon a unification of similar thoughts and ideas? Or a bracketing in consciousness itself, an illusory whirlpool in a field of infinite awareness? All of us, at one time or another, have asked, "Who am I?" But few have experientially explored the query with the vigor that Ramana Maharshi did as a youth, almost turning 17. Instead of accepting temporary answers to the question, Ramana directed his inquiry with such zeal that he did not yield until the ultimate truth was realized. The remarkable feature of Ramana's enlightenment in 1896 in a small room in Madurai, South India, was its utter simplicity. Paul Brunton, in his book A Search in Secret India, retells it. He, Ramana, was sitting alone one day in his room when a sudden and inexplicable fear of death took hold of him. He became acutely aware he was going to die, although outwardly he was in good health. He stretched his body prone upon the floor, fixed his limbs in the rigidity of a corpse, closed his eyes and mouth. "Well then," said I to myself, "this body is dead. It will be carried stiff to the burning ground and then reduced to ashes. But with the death of the body, am I dead? Is the body I? This body is now silent and stiff. But I continue to feel the full force of myself apart from its condition." These are the words with which the Maharshi described the weird experience through which he passed. He seemed to fall into a profound conscious trance wherein he became merged into the very source of selfhood, the very essence of being. He understood quite clearly that the body was a thing apart, and that the I remained untouched by death. The true self was very real, but it was so deep down in man's nature that hitherto he had ignored it. From this transcendental encounter, Ramana emerged a new person. No longer interested in the outward activity of his family and peers, he embarked on a journey to Arunachala, the holy red mountain in Tiruvannamalai, South India, which is a highly revered sacred spot among Hindus. The young sage arrived in the latter part of 1896 and never left the area until his death in 1950. Subsisting on a meager diet, possessing no material wealth, Ramana spent his entire life at Arunachala, meditating or teaching others the way of knowledge. What had he realized that was profound, that it dramatically changed his life and the lives of thousands of others? The answer is deceptively simple. The world arises in a field of consciousness. There is no beginning and ending to consciousness. That very consciousness is our true self. Ramana's understanding was not born of a long intellectual quest, but was based entirely on an experiential realization, which resulted from a direct inquiry into the process of death. At every level of awareness, Ramana intuited that there was one all-pervading being. This being, the real and permanent I, is the creator, sustainer and destroyer of the illusory ego, the small I, which blinds man to his true self. In our ignorance, we believe ourselves restricted to a particular form. In other words, I am this body, I am this person, I am this personality, and so on. Yet the truth is quite the opposite. We are not things, as all particularizations are, but contents within the larger stream of consciousness. Our ordinary waking state illustrates this point, How do you know the world exists? How do you know you have a body? Surprisingly, the answer is, because you are aware, not because the body and the world reveal themselves as ontologically real. Put simply, without awareness, you cannot know anything that exists, much less the relative status of physical properties. Descartes' saying, "I think, therefore I am," glimpsed this fact. It is not thinking that creates "I am," but rather thinking confirms a priori the underlying "I am," or awareness, which allows for mental processes. The world is not material. It is an aspect of consciousness. Our small eyes do not create consciousness. They are merely products of it. Hence, Ramana Maharshi's realization should not be equated with solipsism, the philosophical theory that the self can know nothing but its own modifications and that the self is the only existent thing. As he clearly indicates, the ego, small I, does not create the world, nor is the world unreal. Quite the contrary, Ramana stresses finding the source from which the world and the ego appear permanent and real. That source, Ramana argues, is pure awareness, the true self of man. As Ramana himself so gracefully said, there is only one consciousness, and this, when it identifies itself with the body, projects itself through the eyes and sees the surrounding objects. The individual is limited to the waking state. He expects to see something different and expects the authority of his senses. He will not admit that he who sees the objects seen and the act of seeing are all manifestations of the same consciousness, the one, real self. Meditation helps to overcome the illusion that the self is something to see. Actually, there is nothing to see. How do you recognize yourself now? Do you have to hold a mirror up in front of yourself to recognize yourself? The awareness is itself the I. Realize it, and that is the truth. The beauty of Ramana's insight is that it was exemplified in his everyday actions. Although he spoke little, usually in Tamil, and then in terse and epigrammatic terms, Ramana's presence was tangible to human beings and animals alike. Perhaps the most heartwarming stories surrounding Ramana's life concern his kindness toward animals. Monkeys, dogs, and even cows were counted among his devotees, as they were peculiarly drawn to him. As well as being a strict vegetarian, Ramana always treated lower life forms with the utmost respect. Once, when he stepped on a hornet's nest, he apologized verbally and did not move his leg while it was being severely stung. For most Westerners, the logic of karma extends only to human beings, but for Ramana it extended everywhere. He realized that all forms are manifestations of the one Supreme Spirit. B.V. Narasimha Swami recounts Ramana's relations with animals. A characteristic of Maharshi that strikes every visitor is the way in which he deals with animals, especially those living in the ashram, the spiritual retreat built around Ramana Maharshi. Lakshmi has come. Give her rice food at once, he says, looking from the hall through the window. And the newcomer thinks that some young girl had to be given her meal. But presently steps in a cow, answering to the name Lakshmi. Have the boys been given their food? He again asks. Probably there are little boys brought up here or come for a visit, one would think. But presently a couple of dogs answer a whistle and each is told to take his plate of rice. One watches the Maharshi for days, months, and years and never finds him calling any of these animals it or treating it as less than a human being. Such was Ramana's love that even dangerous animals and reptiles did not harm him. A number of accounts relate that snakes, including cobras, reacted calmly in his presence. Ramana once remarked, "We have come to their residence and have no right to disturb them. They would not molest us if we are well disposed toward them." Naturally, if such benevolence was shown to animals, one can imagine how considerate Ramana was toward human beings. One poignant example of Ramana's ahimsa, non-violence toward living things, arose when his ashram was robbed by 6 dacoits, thieves, on June 26, 1924. When one of his devotees wanted to strike back violently at the robbers, Ramana replied, "Let these thieves play their role, Dharma. We shall stick to ours, non-violence. Let them do what they like. It is for us to bear and forbear. Let us not interfere with them." When Ramana was hit on the left thigh by one of the ruffians, he at once said, "If you are not satisfied yet, you may strike the other leg also." As it turned out, the thief stopped. Eventually, all the robbers were captured by the police after the escape from the ashram. Explaining his stance in the incident, Ramana commented, "These thieves are only misguided men. They are blinded by ignorance. But let us note what is right and stick to it. Sometimes your teeth suddenly bite your own tongue. Do you knock them out in consequence?" Ramana Maharshi did not formally accept any disciples, nor did he see himself as a guru or master. Nevertheless, both in India and abroad, he attracted a large following of people impressed by his teachings and touched by his radiance. Among Ramana's admirers were Dr. Carl Gustav Jung, the famous psychologist, Dr. Paul Brunton, whose book A Search in Secret India made Ramana Maharshi well known, Arthur Osborne, his eventual biographer, and T.M.P. Mahadevan, the respected Indian philosopher. After a long illness, Ramana died of cancer at 8:47 p.m. on April 14, 1950. At that exact moment, writes A. Devaraja Mudalia, a meteor-like flash, leaving a trail of some yards long, appeared in the sky to the southwest and moved north-eastwards to Arunachala Hill, where it disappeared behind the peak. The light that was Bhagavan, Ramana, just merged in the pillar of light that was and is Arunachala, the sacred hill. True to his insight, Ramana did not grieve over the decay of his physical body, but humorously referred to the cancerous growth on his arm as a lingam. In India, the lingam represents Siva, the destroyer god. As to where he will go after death, Ramana Maharshi replied, "They say that I am dying, but I am not going away. Where could I go? I am here." For the great sage of Arunachala, there was no death. He realized that the true self of man is both birthless and timeless.